Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We will be giving the rest of the attendees a few more minutes to hop on, so just hang tight and we'll start in about 10 minutes.
Hello and welcome to the LANDAUER Talks webinar, What is the Role of a Radiation Safety Officer? Presented by Shawn Pickett, Practice Manager of the LANDAUER Radiation Safety Support Services. As you can see, he's well suited to give this presentation as he has served as RSO and continues to do so for many LANDAUER clients. I'm Linda Bosey in LANDAUER Marketing, and I'm happy to welcome you all here today. During this 30-minute session, we'll ask for your input in a couple of polls and then take your questions. Please place them in the section on the right of your screen. At the end of the webinar, you'll get a survey. Please take a few moments to fill it out. Let us know if you'd like to connect and offer your ideas for future topics. If you want the ASRT credit, you'll receive an email following the webinar to access that certificate. Note that this session will be recorded and placed on the landauer.com Knowledge Center for later viewing and sharing. And remember to register for Shawn's next webinar next Thursday, How LANDAUER Dose Reports Support the Work of RSOs. So now on to Shawn.
Thank you so much, Linda. I think the poll stopped my screen sharing. Let me see. There we go. All right, thanks for joining, everyone. Thanks for the intro, Linda. Let's see if I can advance here. All right, so what we're going to learn about today, we're going to identify the radiation safety officer and describe their roles and responsibilities. We're going to describe the elements of a dosimetry program. We're going to recognize ALARA limits and discuss examples, and we're going to define the radiation protection program and apply its use in the medical setting. It's a quick session today, so we're going to keep it very high level on all these items, but we're going to give you like the resources, the documents to kind of go to and learn more information on your own as well. So who is the radiation safety officer? Ultimately, it's the person responsible for implementing the radiation protection program. Where can you go find information about a radiation safety officer and their background, what kind of roles and responsibilities that they should have in your organization? If you're a radiology manager or something like that, and you're trying to figure out what should the RSO be doing every day. I know I've been in a lot of facilities where they're just not sure. And so there's some definite guidance documents out there that are great to use. And one of them is AAPM Report 160. This is a task group that was put together to decide what qualifications and roles and responsibilities are appropriate, especially based on the RSO's background. This is the table of contents from that document. You can kind of see what's in there, about the radiation protection program, the authorities and responsibilities, the RSO letter of understanding, selecting an RSO, adding or removing an RSO support, like duties that they can delegate, and just how to overall run a good functional program. There's really some great appendices in there as well, outlining RSO duties, a sample RSO executive management letter, just some sample reports and things that you can use to bring your program to another level. Also, NRC Regulation 35.50 describes the training for an RSO or an ARSO. This is that regulation, so definitely refer to the NRC rule if you're curious about that. Many states, agreement states, also have this spelled out either in the regulations or in a guide, or they incorporate this rule by reference. There's a lot of states that just say refer to NRC 35.50 for the training and education for a radiation safety officer. This isn't the whole rule, but this just kind of gives you an idea of what it is. There's multiple ways to become an RSO, and it's important to understand who can be qualified. Especially as you try to decide who your RSO is, it can be a lengthy process from writing your amendment to the state or the NRC, waiting for approval and waiting for them to come back. Someone can start as RSO as well by temporary status, and we do that quite often with someone that's already qualified as RSO, and they can kind of start on day one instead. Now, the term RSO, or radiation safety officers, is really used kind of loosely in a lot of areas, but really we try to reserve it for radioactive material use. It is kind of used synonymously with X-ray machines. We try to separate that term with person responsible for radiation protection. This is also different in a lot of states. Some states specifically use RSO on their forms, really regardless of what the radiation type is, and other states use different nomenclature. IRRP, the individual responsible for radiation protection, it's kind of different everywhere. But I think it's important to determine, at least to understand, that typically a radiation safety officer is when you have a radioactive materials license. So what is the role of the RSO? What do they do? And you're typically going to have this spelled out either in the RPP or as part of the radioactive materials license when you submitted it to your agency, typically during application time or renewal, or if you named a new RSO, then you would have typically when you submit a license amendment, it's a letter to the organization telling them what parts of your radioactive materials you're going to license you're going to change. And then it's a delegation of authority form, basically management saying that you have the ability and the authority to speak on behalf of our license, make legally binding statements, and overall have the ability to conduct radiation safety practices in our organization. And they need to be signed by management and signed by the RSO and kept on file, of course. Now, where can you find out even some more information on the roles and responsibilities? In addition to AAPM Report 160 I showed you previously, there's also an NRC guide, New Reg Guide 1556, Volume 9, Revision 3, which is the newest revision. And then you can go straight to your agreement state agencies to provide examples of those roles and responsibilities. Many states don't have those, and they incorporate New Reg Guide 1556 by reference. Some states do have their own specific guides, states like Florida, North Carolina, many states do have their own specific guide. But here's kind of what you're going to find in that. Hey, this is one of the appendix from AAPM Report 160, and it's a table to kind of go through each item of your radioactive materials license or the duties and assign someone to do that, whether it's the RSO or a technologist or a secretary or the physicist or someone like that. And then this is the front page of the NRC New Reg 1556, Volume 9, Revision 3. If you Google that, you'll find it. These are open and available on the internet. And if you want to, some gentle reading material to put yourself at sleep at night, then I definitely recommend the New Reg series. It's a lot of good information in there, though. It's really nice to use timely as well to kind of know where everything lives and understand it. So then whenever the questions come up, no one can memorize everything, but you at least know where they are and you know where the information lives, and then you can refer to it when it's necessary. So responsibilities are different for licenses of different scope, but the overall goal is for the RSO to identify and correct radiation safety problems. You might have a license that has a lot of therapeutic use, but an RSO who might qualify to be the RSO because they have the experience, but they're not going to necessarily go in and conduct maybe all of the radiation safety activities. They might have a team of people. We often do that at LANDAUER, where we'll have a corporate RSO, and then we have physicists in the field that are going on site very regularly, and they're doing equipment testing and program auditing and a variety of types of details based on the contract. Everyone's a little different based on their need. We kind of customize everything. But ultimately, the duty has to be done. And whether it's the RSO performing it or the RSO ensures that it is performed is really the duty of the RSO. So, main thing is to understand is they can delegate. They don't have to physically do everything, but they can have a team behind them to help conduct those activities. But ultimately, they have to have the authority. That's the biggest part. And the biggest part of I guess problems we see with clients and we see in the field is the RSO sometimes is a person that maybe got voluntold to do the job, and while they have the qualifications, then maybe they're a really experienced nuclear medicine technologist, but they don't know maybe a lot about fluoro and radiation oncology and all these other departments that helps them. So whenever they go in and they try to be the RSO and act as that authority, maybe they have an ALARA overexposure or something, then they have to have that backing by management to conduct, to maybe stop radiation safety activity if they have a problem. Maybe a physician's not playing by the rules or something, and it's creating an unsafe environment. And so the RSO absolutely has to have that authority to stop work, basically. Now, what are the day-to-day responsibilities of that RSO? Ultimately, it's the licensee or registrant that's responsible for radiation safety because they have the license. I always try to explain to people, a lot of people will ask me, who's responsible for this? And maybe it's a big hospital system with third parties that come on site, contracted workers. Maybe they license out the radiation safety activities or something like that. Who's ultimately responsible? It's the person that owns the license in almost every case. They have to identify the RSO and they establish their duties in writing. But when push comes to shove and maybe an inspector comes by and they give them a violation or citation or something, who owns that? It's always the licensee or registrant. Now, maybe the RSO is found to not, maybe be doing all aspects of their job or something like that, but ultimately the licensee is going to be paying the fine for that. Unless the RSO is negligent, obviously, or something like that. Now, typically, what do these duties do day to day? That includes auditing of the RPP, that radiation protection program, overseeing other policies and procedures involving radiation, instructing workers on the use of radiation, managing the license, the registrations, supervision of radioactive material orders, shipments, signing all those documents, authorizing the use, personnel monitoring, labeling of radiation areas, like putting the right signage up everywhere, all the record keeping that goes along with it. We could do a whole talk probably on record keeping, along with any other duties that it's assigned. It's basically what is on that form that you submit to the NRC to say these are your job duties. Job duties for this might be in addition to the other job duties that the person's responsible for. We often see that, like I say, for example, the nuke med tech, who is a really great nuke med tech, maybe supervises the department, becomes RSO. Now, in addition to all the supervisory responsibilities, now they're also acting as RSO, and they get these additional in writing duties. So that's often case, Landauer will act as RSO for a lot of organizations, especially when they're in transition. Say they had an RSO that was there for 30 years, they gave their notice and they're retiring or whatever the reason, especially in the age of coronavirus, a lot of people are taking early retirement. And then, maybe they forgot that person was the RSO. I've seen that in a lot of organizations. A person walks out the door, 30 days goes by, now you're kind of a little hot water because you don't have an RSO that's acting on the license. So Landauer will act as that intermediary in a lot of cases and maybe can be your RSO for a year while we train someone, or you can have that time to find another RSO that can take over fully the duties. We also act as permanent RSO for a lot of locations. So what is an occupational dosimetry program? This is a quintessential piece of your radiation protection program and the RSO duties. It's like the meat and potatoes of the program. But how do you work this program? It all starts with personnel dosimeters. And whether you use Landauer or whether you use someone else, that is how you're day-to-day monitoring your activities. You might have an RSO that's responsible for monitoring 8,000 employees or something. There's no way they're regularly going and supervising and putting their eyes on all those people. So we use the personnel dosimeters as our, canaries in the coal mine per se, or that early dog whistle to tell us that something is happening or going on that we need to check out. And there's a lot of components of a personnel dosimetry program, and we're actually going to talk about that in our next talk in a little bit more detail around how that dosimetry program, how the RSO utilizes it. So I won't get too much detail here. Make sure and tune in next week, but definitely the linchpin, the hitchpin of the whole thing. So dosimeter reports, they're evaluated regularly to ensure those employees are not exceeding dose limits. Typically, you monitor anyone capable of achieving 10% of an annual dose limit. We also like to establish monitoring regularly with regular professions like nuke med techs. They're going to get a whole body dosimeter and a ring. Any individuals working with fluoroscopy, any high dose areas we definitely know where 10% is, but obviously we need to monitor more people than we probably need to at first to determine who is eligible for receiving 10% of an annual dose limit. You don't know oftentimes unless you monitor. And even some states require periodic monitoring that's kind of loosely identified or defined in the state. And so they want to see anyone that's working with radiation at some interval. Maybe you did it 10 years ago, maybe a lot's changed in 10 years, and you need to monitor those people again to get an idea of what their dose levels are. Regardless of what type of dosimeter you use and how it works, you do need some actionable trigger levels. These are levels that you establish in your dosimetry program that tells you to do the next thing. And these are called ALARA limits. Now, what is ALARA? I would probably lose my my ability to be RSO if I didn't say ALARA and discuss ALARA. I think that's you always have to start with ALARA. And I'm sure a lot of people on the call know what ALARA is, but it's the acronym for as low as reasonably achievable. It basically means that radiation workers get some level of radiation exposure, but we want to keep it as reasonable as possible. Obviously, we could spend all the money in the world, we could get the thickest lead and protect employees and physicians and everyone and the patient almost 100%. But it's not reasonable. It's not a reasonable cost. It would create musculoskeletal injuries and back pain and all these problems from wearing too heavy of lead. So it's a balance, right? It's the reasonable cost, reasonable weight, along with reasonable protection. So these ALARA limits are established to keep your workers from going over those annual limits. As long as you're following the limits in these alert trigger levels throughout the year, you won't have employees exceed a dose level unless they receive it all in one quarter, basically. And how do these work? So ultimately, you look at 5,000 millirem for the entire year. That's the dose limit for a radiation worker in the US. So if you break that down to 4 quarters, you have 1,250 millirem for each quarter as a maximum. And then you take 10% and 30% of that, and you get 125 and 375 respectively. So what do you do when you have someone that achieves 125 millirem? It's something that you should document. It should maybe go to Radiation Safety Committee, but absolutely the RSO should know about this. They should have some type of tracker, some type of quarterly recap, so maybe a letter that they write. If it's an employee that is working in fluoroscopy, I'm probably less concerned. But if it's an employee that's a mammography tech, I'm definitely concerned. They shouldn't probably be getting much more than an M. And so it really depends on their job role and what they do. Maybe there's a reason they went over this dose. Maybe they accidentally wore their occupational monitor whenever they had a medical exam. Maybe they went in for a CAT scan or something and they accidentally wore their monitor, or they had a bone scan in nuclear medicine and they didn't even think about it the next day, and they put later that day, and they went to work and put their monitor on and they received medical dose, and then it's not really attributable to their occupational dose. So maybe there's a reason for these, that they go over the limits. There definitely could be a reason that's reasonable, and maybe there's not, but you don't know unless you investigate, right? So, and you document it. That's the biggest part, is that, if you go out and just verbally communicate this to someone, how do you know that? How's the inspector know that when they come in and look at your dosimeter records? So I like to use an ALARA letter, and I actually meant to attach it here, but I slightly forgot. But LANDAUER provides an ALARA letter. It's an ALARA memo, and it's really easy to use. We also have a managed service that provides a little more detail and a little more help with that letter. But you can get that in your MyLDR portal and turn that on with customer service to get those letters automatically generated whenever someone achieves a dose level. Now, I say 125 and 375 because that's what I recommend, and that's what's most standard use, but these vary all over the place. Some people use 100 and 300, some people use 150 and 400. It's really just kind of everywhere, and it's really up to the facility and what radiation levels they use, what type of workers, what type of equipment, all those things to decide how they manage those levels. But the main thing is that you have some levels and you have a program and you're managing that program. And at ALARA level 2 over 375, this is your trigger to do an investigation. So there, in that case, you have a 2-page letter, a letter notifying someone of their overexposure, and then a second page to ask them 5 questions. How did you get the dose? And you can go refer to our form to get those questions, but basically, how did you get your exposure? Was there anything that's unreasonable that happened? Is there anything you can think of why this, is that you did get this exposure, and kind of walk through those questions with them. I've had employees that as soon as I bring it up, they're like, oh yeah, I left my dosimeter in the room and we scanned a patient and that's probably why. And then I have other employees that, have deer in the headlights look, and they have really no clue why they achieved that dose. Now we get to the last part of this radiation protection program, because that's the overall governance document that you use. It's your playbook for radiation safety. It tells you what to do in your organization. LANDAUER, we write these constantly. We write many a week for licensees and X-ray registrants all over the country. And this is the first couple of pages, but these can be 7 to 12 to more pages long. We try to keep them as simple as we possibly can. This one was North Carolina. If you recognize these North Carolina references, they're all tailored to the individual organization, what modalities they use, and then the state that they're in. So if it's NRC or it's some state that has a lot of certain requirements that are in there, they're going to be captured in that radiation safety program. If you don't know what the RPP or RSP or any of this stuff is, we definitely recommend that you have one. It's almost required in all states, and you can kind of infer it to be required in most states. But whether it's required or not, it's a really good idea to have one, and it's going to keep you kind of your head above water. Especially if you're a place that has a lot of locations, this is a great thing to have, because you can have one centralized document and then have it tailored to each state, have the same look and feel, saved in the same place, committed the same way, but yet unique to each location based on what they need. Now, you need to review this annually for any changes necessary. Some states require that you actually submit this prior to approval, and other agencies just require that you keep it on file. And like I said, not all states require it, but we really recommend it. But ultimately, the RSO is responsible for implementing this thing. So it's important to have it. It's important for everybody to know about it. And then ultimately, the RSO is responsible for making sure all the things in it happen. And that's our presentation today. And I want to make sure that everyone at the end of this sees our survey, fill out the survey so you can get your certificate for record keeping. And I know, Linda, if there's any questions, I think we have time for some questions.
Yeah, we do. We have some time for questions. Just want to remind everyone that, pardon me, when we post the webinar online, we will make the PowerPoint available as well. I'm not certain if anyone else had some audio issues, but we will have that presentation for you as well as the PowerPoints. A few questions came in, and excuse me. One of the questions is, who is appropriate for an RSO role? You had mentioned nuke med technologists, but what other kind of technologists are appropriate, or is a radiologist a physician sometimes an RSO?
That's a great question. We get that question all the time, and we get a lot of people that think they could be RSO, and they think that because they're board certified in a certain modality type, they can just, by virtue of their certification, in every case be RSO. But it's not always the case. There is training and training and education requirements. Sometimes it requires a supervision underneath an RSO for a year. A nuclear medicine technologist definitely can become an RSO. A recently graduated nuke med tech probably has most of the hours that's required, just 200 hours of education along with a year of training. So then it's the hands-on training, and it's the training in all the emergency use types in your license. It's the supervision by an RSO, and then signing on the RSO 313A form by the NRC to demonstrate that they are trained and they have all the necessary background to do their job. Medical physicists are also pretty common to be the RSO. And they can be really great RSOs too. You definitely want someone with the training and the background to be the RSO. That's really the most important thing. It can be a variety of people. It can be a variety of backgrounds. You can go straight through education and training without certification. You can go through the certification route along with some documentation of education and training and become the RSO. But really the important thing is that they have the required education and training specifically for the radioactive materials or radiation generating machines that you have on your site, and they meet the state or NRC guidance to do so.
Great, thank you. A couple other questions came in about RSOs. Is there always just one per facility, or are there sometimes more than one RSO depending on a health system?
Oh, that's a really great question too. So I briefly touched on Associate RSO, ARSO, which is a newer title given by the NRC, because they recognize that one RSO might not be enough and you need backup. And there also might be a need for multiple RSOs because there's more than one modality type or something that's on the license. And so you can now today, you can appoint one radiation safety officer. Typically, there's a couple states that'll allow like 2 names on there. But overall, you have the named RSO, and then if you want a backup, you have an associate RSO. That person needs to have the same exact background and training, or at least an equivalent background and training as the RSO. There's not like a second level that's has less requirements. The associate RSO should be just as trained and ready to be the RSO as the actual RSO. There's really not a difference in the background and training. But you definitely could have, and a lot of places will actually split their radioactive materials license. They might have a general license for their diagnostic radioactive use types, and then they might have a therapeutic license for the separate, like if they have HDR and other radiation oncology elements that require radioactive material license, they might have two. So then they can have separate named people, maybe separate mailing addresses and organization, whatever, however it works for your organization. If it's like across the hospital, adjacent to another street, but yet still part of the organization, a lot of times like states like California might require you to have a separate license. It's kind of dependent on the location.
Okay. Question came in on, you mentioned dosimeters, which I assume you meant whole body. What about trigger levels for ring badges or extremity readings?
Absolutely, that is a really great question. And so I would go by the same rule of thumb of the 10% and 30% rule, because those are just great trigger levels to use if they're over 10%. Most of your workers aren't going to be, in most cases, on a quarterly level. So definitely, I always recommend 10 and 30%. And it's definitely a great place to use. And you definitely should have trigger levels for really lens dose, for ring dose, but using whole body dose is the early indicator. If they're going over their whole body, they're probably, that's the first one they're going to trigger in most cases. Now, I've seen some really high ring badges that are separate from whole body dose for whatever reason that was necessary, but absolutely, yes, you should have trigger levels for really any dose type. And we use whole body. We really recommend collar is where we mostly see people badge, like the badge location. Some people do use chest. However, a lot of times when it's chest, it's because they have their dosimeter attached to a lanyard, and that dosimeter will flip around to the back side. And dosimeter should always be exposed with the radiation in the front, like perpendicular to the flat face of the dosimeter. So if it's being exposed from the back, there's actually attenuating material on the front of the dosimeter that's not being utilized, and it can create some erroneous radiation fields. Like we see some that are in fluoroscopy rooms that maybe they had their dosimeter flipped around and it indicates a beta field, a beta environment, and that's not necessarily true, but it's just what maps back to the dosimeter when it's analyzed. So it is important to have the right wear location that is on your dosimeter. If everyone looks at the front of the dosimeter, there's a little person on it and there's a little dot that indicates where that should be worn. And if it's in the middle of the body, it might be a chest badge. If it's up by the collar, it's a collar badge. But inspectors know this, and they'll go around and look at your staff. And that's a really common thing we see, is that the dosimetry program is just not managed that well. And you have a variety of use of wear locations, and then no one wearing them consistently. So you might have everyone identified as a chest, but when you walk around and audit the program, everyone is at the collar, or vice versa, or it's just all over the place. But definitely, it's part of managing that program well, is having it identified properly and then having it implemented properly.
Really good practical information, Shawn. Along those lines, too, there's a question about fetal badges and any concerns that the RSOs especially have around that.
Definitely, and we use different trigger levels for fetal monitoring, and it's actually it's similar to what we use, but you can only expose a fetus to 500 milligram per gestational period, so per pregnancy, it's a 500 milligram cap, and what we do is 30 milligram and 50 milligram for trigger levels each month. So if they're over 50 milligram in a month on their fetal badge, that is a clear indication that they need to be reassigned, or at least figure out why did they get this exposure, because those badges should almost be always M. They're worn underneath the lead at the edge of the belly as it grows. So you want to make sure that is being worn correctly, one, and then monitored on a monthly basis. And then if they're going over 50 milligram, we're going to think about reassigning them. We might even talk to them at 30 milligram to see what's going on. Now, we see most commonly in organizations where they'll monitor people for fetal dosimetry, and they terminate the dosimeter in mild DR, but they don't terminate they don't end the pregnancy. add an end date to the pregnancy. Maybe they don't know it or whatever reason, but they still see those dosimeters coming in, so they just go in and cancel that dosimeter. But that's a problem because they still show up on your pregnancy report. If you guys use your pregnancy report, it shows up on that report, and it starts to get highlighted after so many days. I think it's like 280 days or something like that. And it starts to pop up in a yellow color telling you that, hey, this person is past a typical gestation period for a pregnant participant. And you probably should do something about that. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe they're trying to get pregnant and they want to be monitored. But in most cases, like 99% of the cases I see, it's because they didn't end the pregnancy in the system. So basically, my LDR thinks they're still pregnant, but you're just not using a pregnancy badge. You don't have to use a fetal dosimeter. There's not a requirement to do that. You have to keep the gestational dose below 50 milligram. So if you have a radiation worker that's working in I guess a higher dose area like fluoroscopy or nuclear medicine or something, you want to have a separate monitor so the dose isn't being pulled from their whole body monitor. So if they're wearing a lead apron, then the fetus is benefiting from the lead apron, from that protection. So you want to get credit for that. And so definitely we want to order a separate dosimeter for the fetus. You want to wear it in the proper location. It should be under the lead if they wear lead. If it's a nuke med tech, they just wear it at the belly location, and they need to be cognizant of the radiation exposure. Usually this also comes with a declaration form that the employee would declare pregnancy to the RSO, and then we order the dosimeter. There's also usually instructions that go along with it on how to wear that dosimeter, any questions to ask. And then, but the main thing to also know about this is they don't have to declare pregnancy, because of workers' rights and all that great stuff. You don't have to do it. So you can't force an employee to declare pregnancy. It's totally up to the employee to do that.
All right, we're almost at the close here, and there looks like there's interest in the ALARA forms themselves. I just wanted to tell you that those forms, if you just wanted to see what they are, they're actually on the LANDAUER website, landauer.com, in dosimetry under forms, actually. But someone had asked about that as to where they are in my LDR and how to best use that. And this is our time to shout out about the next 2 webinars in this series. The next one we mentioned is next Thursday at the same time, where Shawn will talk specifically the whole time about how the dose reports assist RSOs. And then the third of the series, which is on the 25th of March, that will be dedicated to my LDR, how to use it, how to access reports. And so it's designed as a 3-part series because we're at the end of our time now. So just encouraging you all to fill out the survey and please come back. We would love to have you. Watch early next week to see this posted on the landauer.com site. You'll be getting an email as to where to find all of it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, everyone.